I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. What are we looking at today, Rob?
We're looking at a collection of poems that were posted in and sort of around and all over town, Tiananmen Square, in 1976. It's kind of referred to as the Tiananmen Incident that came right after the death of Zhou Enlai, who was, I was about to say second in command, but by 76 he kind of wasn't anymore. It's a very complicated period. Anyway, it's a fascinating collection, not because the poems themselves are particularly beautiful.
Because they're not.
Because they're not. They're mostly sentimental and kind of shrill classical evocations in honor of Zhou Enlai. But they're fascinating, A, because by all accounts they were written spontaneously by just the folk who were there. So we're not talking about trained poets, just people, you know. And they're fascinating as well because it's a neat example of something that's very old in Chinese tradition, which is protesting one thing in the guise of something else. So, you know, long ago, one of the ways that classical scholars used to protest what was going on was through written commentaries on one or another of the five classics at the time, right? Mm-hmm. So it was safe to put it in the margins, but you couldn't write it like in bold print, you know? So this is an example of that sort of like, we're going to let you know just how angry we are in a way that doesn't appear we're doing it.
One of the interesting periods in Chinese history where that happens is the Cultural Revolution actually starts out with a play in Beijing where the vice mayor of Beijing writes a play criticizing Mao using something from a previous period. Which the Cultural Revolution is quite important to our podcast today. So maybe we should just dive in.
Let's just dive in. And let me just preface it real quick because Lee's going to give us a breakdown of this by saying all that follows is going to kind of be based on the relative reputations of Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai.
This is almost kind of less of a this is literature written about history and literature that functioned as a historical document, not as literary documents, right?
So what's the big deal with Zhou Enlai and Mao together?
So Zhou Enlai and Mao. So Mao Zedong, of course, was the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. He's one of the most famous people in the 20th century, and Zhou Enlai was kind of his right-hand man for a while. They knew each other before the revolution was successful. They knew each other back in the 1920s, 1930s. They worked together. They were close. But they represented two separate directions in the Communist Party. Zhou was oftentimes much more practical. He was okay with economic growth and with some elements that people might say are capitalism. He was just very pragmatic. And also, I think we've talked about this on other episodes, but he was also just very well loved by a lot of people. No one I've ever met in China has said they hated Zhou Enlai. I've met people who say they hate Mao, but no one has ever told me they hated Zhou Enlai. Mao was, historically, I would say, the more important figure. He thought big, but he wasn't necessarily the best bureaucrat. So whereas Zhou Enlai was this pragmatic guy, Mao was full of big romantic ideas that changed the world, but maybe he couldn't run a government very well.
Right.
And there are several points in the PRC's history where he actually kind of gets pushed aside, Mao does. So the sort of, I don't want to say a fight between the two of them, but kind of a struggle over who controlled more of the government. So one of those periods where there is quite a bit of struggle between Mao and Mao's faction, which is more of a leftist, Marxist faction.
The hardcore.
Against Zhou's faction, who was represented by people you might know like Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shaoqi. That would be the Great Leap Forward, that period where this really came out. And that was 1957 to, we'll say, 1959, 62, something like, depending on how you define it. Mao tried to implement these radical economic reforms, which involved really crazy ideas about the people and economics. We don't need to get into them. They didn't work. And
people really didn't work.
People, like, as in really didn't work, Rob, you mean like millions of people starving.
Tens of millions starving, yes.
This may have actually been the greatest starvation in the history of the world. I've heard some scholars suggest that. It's hard to come by numbers, but anyways, it didn't work. Zhou's faction sort of pushed Mao out of power. Now, he wasn't removed from power, but he just kind of sat in the background. They put him on the kiddie table.
He had to go sit at the kids. I was just about to say he had to go sit at the kids' table,
and that didn't really sit well with Mao because
he's Mao.
He's Mao, and he did this incredible thing, and he changed China in a very drastic way. He thought he deserved a little bit more than the kiddies' table of history. So he started this other little thing that is the Cultural Revolution. And that begins by the vice mayor of Beijing. He writes a play that criticizes Mao using some historical precedent from like the Ming Dynasty or something like that. And Mao says, you ain't going to do that. And he's out of sort of state control, but he calls on the people to support him. So
specifically the young people.
The young people specifically. And he essentially just creates almost a civil war in China. For 10 years, there was fighting between multiple factions. No one really knew who was in charge. And you might not be surprised by this, but this didn't go down so well in terms of economic growth. Not as much starvation as in the Great Leap Forward, but still like just really horrendous things
widespread
happening.
Violence.
Exactly. And so this all kind of peters off in 1976. The Gang of Four, which is Mao's wife and three of her closest friends, are running the leftist wing of the government, and they're kind of in charge.
They're driving the Cultural Revolution bus.
Exactly. And they are big, like, supporters of the Cultural Revolution. Zhou Enlai was less of a supporter. He tried to moderate the influence of the Cultural Revolution when he could. Sometimes he couldn't. But Zhou Enlai dies in January of 1976. Mao is going to die in October of 1976. No one knows exactly when he's going to die, but it's pretty clear he's on his way out. And these two great figures of the revolution are on their way out, and people know that something's going down, but they don't know exactly how it's going to play out. And when Zhou dies, a couple of months later, during Qingmingjie, which is the
Tomb Sweeping Day.
Thank you. People come out into Beijing to sort of protest the Gang of Four's control and to support Zhou Enlai and like talk about how amazing he was. So these poems are historical documents coming out of a kind of rejection of the Gang of Four.
Yeah, and it's an interesting rejection because they couldn't march in the street saying to hell with the Gang of Four.
Yeah, you can't. Work. Again, you can't say directly we don't like the Gang of Four's policies, but you can always couch it in other terms
by praising someone else in the party. And this is one of the reasons I find this collection so fascinating is that this is a spontaneous, by all accounts, gathering to protest what has been going on in the Cultural Revolution, and specifically the way the Gang of Four has sort of taken things over by holding up as a figure of almost mythical glory Mao's former right-hand man. It's an interesting thing because when you read this collection, and I've read a lot of it, at first blush it sounds like a just straight-up praise of the Communist Party and the glories of the Socialist Revolution, etc. When you read it that way.
But
it's not.
And I'll bet, even though to us it sounds like this praise when we read it, and I'm sure the people who are writing this, their lives oftentimes depended on the vicissitudes of distinguishing between different brands of party speak. And so even though to us it sounds almost like it just sounds like blanket praise of the Communist Party, they were very clear. It was very loud to them.
Right. And this is one of the reasons I find stuff that scans as propaganda so interesting. At the beginning of the podcast, you're like, Rob's a big fan of propaganda. I am, in the sense that it tends to just get pushed aside. Well, it's propaganda, therefore it's crap. Aesthetically, perhaps, but
aesthetically, definitely, this stuff is not fun to read.
Enough. It's really not. No, it's really not.
Rob is brave, very brave to have read as much as he did.
This is the thing, though, is it's a little bit like if you're in China today and you tune in and watch like CCTV 9 or like one of the government-controlled stations. You're watching this news and you're like, oh my word, this is just in your face propaganda. And in China, you should just either turn it off or go watch a movie or something, because I hated it. But if you're willing to listen to it, you can learn a heck of a lot about the way public and official discourse works in China. Yeah. The fact, for example, that in 76, this collection of poems we're talking about, these are poems people didn't paint pictures. They didn't just draw single characters. They didn't write prose. This was rhymed, metered poetry.
It's interesting that this protest took a poetic form. Like I can't think of other examples of this in China or outside China. I'm sure there are some in China, but in a sort of mass poetic protest. Like, who does that other than the Chinese?
Right, and it's fascinating because Mao was a poet. In some ways, I can't say for sure this was a thumbing the nose at Mao this way, but they're using the art form, one of the few art forms that Mao didn't really tinker with too much. Like, Mao's poetry is also full of classical allusions, for as much as he tried to get rid of it all.
Which these poems are very full of classical allusions and kind of classical language, which is interesting because the Cultural Revolution, one of the things it was focused on is let's sweep away the old ways, the four olds. Thank you. I don't know the four olds. You don't need to know the four olds.
It doesn't really matter. It's like old thought, old
ideas,
stuff, very vague categories.
But one of the things that was oftentimes gotten rid of is this kind of like poetic tradition, and there was a rejection of this poetic tradition.
If you write a poem referencing, the classic of the mountains and the seas, or the I Ching, clearly you are a capitalist roader.
And so by embracing this classical tradition, even if it's very poorly written, they're doing something that's incredibly political.
Right, and this is why I say it's so important to pay attention to the internal dynamics of this stuff, because if you dismiss it, you miss the fact that, yes, they are praising Zhou Enlai, one of the party's architects, but they're doing it in a way you weren't supposed to do necessarily. They're doing it in a way that's flaunting what the last 10 years have taught them, and they're also doing it in an unsanctioned public event. So there's multiple layers of they're appropriating a discourse that for many, many centuries, even millennia in China, was the way you got into official circles, was poetry.
And this was perceived at the time as an incredibly as an incredibly political move. Deng Xiaoping, the Gang of Four thought that Deng Xiaoping was ginning up this as a way to strengthen his hand against the Gang of Four, and they fired him. They sent him down to the pigsty. They I don't know what he was cleaning, but he had been cleaning toilets before, and I believe they sent him down to clean more toilets. He had been the head of the day-to-day Chinese government, and he was just sent off to clean poop.
And ironically, he did come back and lead the party later anyway.
And he was not involved in getting rid of the Gang of Four, but they kind of like very quickly the Gang of Four was wrapped up and Deng Xiaoping was brought back to power. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure it didn't feel quick to him when he was cleaning latrines down in the South. Or
so, you had this collection of poetry that's laying hold of a tradition that used to be an official path to power and status, right? Not as much in the 20th century, but certainly for the vast majority of the rest of Chinese history, well into the 19th. They're laying hold of an art form that was sort of Mao's jam, right? And they're doing it to praise not necessarily Mao's rival, but certainly a guy that Mao could never totally be on board with, because Zhou, like you said, was a pragmatist. He's like, look, revolution's great. You know what else is great? Having enough money. That's cool too. We should try to do that, So they're praising that kind of person with Mao's jam in the language of official culture, right? Yeah. And they're doing it in an unsanctioned public event, which, if I remember the history correctly, was broken up violently later. Something like it didn't last too long.
Yeah.
And so the collection itself is less noteworthy for, like, if I just pick 4 poems at random, you kind of get the idea of the collection. There's no, like, greatest hits. They're very, very similar in tone. But even the similarity is interesting, because if you had a collection and all the poems were vastly different, that would say something about the kinds of people who were gathered there. But the fact that they all, or the vast majority of them, share in about 3 different kinds of rhyme and meter, and they're using very similar reading elements, shows that even after all this time in the Cultural Revolution, people were still reading a lot of the stuff that people had been reading for centuries. They haven't changed that much, and that's just a fascinating thing. And one of the things I would close on is that it really hasn't changed since then either. When you watch the news, it's hard to know sometimes what to do with China, especially in the Xi Jinping era. But people have always read the same kinds of things that people are reading in the 70s, right? They're not supposed to necessarily. There's stuff that is good and stuff that's bad, politically, but people are going to get a hold of it anyway. There's always going to be a large group of people in China who are reading, frankly, kind of whatever they want.
I think that's a great place to end it. Yeah, I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.